the time that this video is being made, it's been about half a year since I released The Transformation of Ireland, a deep dive into the world of immigration and demographic projections for the country. Since then, the video has racked up close to 100,000 views, which for the size of this channel is an amazing thing to see. Thank you to everyone who watched and shared it, and hopefully you got something useful from it. At the start of that video, I began by talking about the town of Lisdoonvarna and what had happened there after the state and a local hotelier got together and decided to set up a new accommodation centre for more than 100 asylum seekers. Prior to this, the permanent population of the town only numbered about 300 people, and the proposed centre therefore threatened to transform it virtually overnight. If you want the full details of that story, I recommend you watch the aforementioned video, which you can find on this channel. The short version, however, is that the state and hotelier eventually chose to ignore overwhelming local opposition and set up the centre anyway. Fast forward now to the last month or so, where the government have entered into a number of new agreements with other hotel operators in similarly remote, low population parts of Ireland to set up more accommodation for asylum seekers in underused hotels. As with Lisdoonvarna, the deals to create the new centres in Ruski, Wicklow, Abbeyleash and Moville appear to have been done in secret, neither informing local representatives nor the public that live in and around the proposed locations. So far, all of these announcements have been met with angry pushback from locals, with one hotel even being subjected to an apparent arson attack. But as with Lisdoonvarna earlier this year, there is yet no sign that the government or the majority of the hotel operators are willing to listen to people's concerns, or to alter any of their plans. It's been estimated that as many as 100 asylum seekers will be moved into Moville, 100 into Wicklow, 80 into Ruski, and approximately 60 who have already moved into Abbeyleash. It is expected that more locations will be announced over the coming months.
He should have a veto.
What perhaps to many outside observers seems like a comparatively small matter has suddenly fired up into one of the most controversial issues in the country. Many living in the towns in question have argued that the school, medical and police provisions in their locations are ill-equipped to deal with the kind of population increases that these moves will mean. Valid though these concerns are, one can't help but think many take up this particular angle of dissent as it appears to be the closest thing they have to a respectable objection to the asylum centres, given that voicing concerns in the current social climate about the demographic and cultural transformations that result from bringing in significant numbers of people from the third world means being met with accusations of racism and bigotry. But if we reject that sort of framing and question the very idea that demographic transformation, i.e. diversity, is a moral imperative in itself, we soon see that people's desire for their hometowns to retain the character and population they already have really is not that bizarre. Moreover, although the overall number of asylum seekers is comparatively small, when considered in the broader context of rural Irish life and migration to the West and Ireland more generally, you begin to understand people's discomfort. So let's start breaking down some of that context in which this debacle exists. First, before we even look into Ireland's asylum seeker accommodation programme, direct provision, let's look at some of the context that these rural communities exist in. Ireland as a country is very heavily weighted in terms of population density, governance, wealth, and resource distribution towards the two major population centres on the eastern side of the island, Dublin in the Republic of Ireland and Belfast in Northern Ireland. As a general rule of thumb, the further westward one goes from these two cities, the more one enters territory that feels remote from the centres of power and less well provisioned in terms of basic infrastructure. Although there have been improvements in recent decades, these imbalances have existed since at least the earliest days of Britain's colonial rule. Emigration has been a feature of Irish society for many decades, before even partition and the creation of the two modern states on the island. The last couple of years have seen a reversal of this, with many people who emigrated in years past now returning to the country. But most Irish families have relatives who have left for the USA, Britain, Australia, etc., and not returned. This has been especially devastating in rural communities, where many villages and small towns still struggle to retain their youth population, especially the more talented and bright ones, not just to the lure of life overseas, but also to the pull of internal migration to Dublin and to a lesser extent Belfast or Cork. This makes economic and cultural development in these areas difficult, and leads to the thinning of important resources, such as postal services and doctor surgeries. But on a more human level, also pulls families apart and disrupts community life. Arguably, this feeds into the identity that rural Ireland has, proudly more rugged and independent than their urban counterparts, but ironically fostering a sense of neglect and not receiving the benefits that come with being more urbanised. This is of course a complex problem to solve, but it's one that many rural communities feel has been consistently overlooked by the powers that be. Now against this backdrop, many feel the government are embarking on a policy of singling out rural areas as places to move asylum seekers into under the program of direct provision. Direct provision was set up around the year 2000, initially as a temporary measure to house asylum seekers and have their needs provided for by private contracting partners to the state. Asylum seekers are given accommodation, food, heating and household maintenance, etc., along with a small personal allowance, which is set to rise shortly. Despite this, life in direct provision has been described as demoralizing and overcrowded. Restrictions are placed on when and where residents can go. Having visitors is often made difficult, and quite often people are not at liberty to prepare food for themselves. Despite this, direct provision brings in a significant amount of revenue for the private companies that enter into partnerships with the state to house the asylum seekers. For example, the accommodation centre in Mosney, County Meath, owned by Mosney Holidays, reportedly brought in 127 million euros of government money between 2002 and 2017. Another company, Bridgestock Limited, took at least 91 million euro between 2000 and 2017. Bridgestock have recently been named as the firm who will operate the new direct provision centre in Moville, County Donegal. Another company, Mill Street Equestrian Services, received 76 million euros in fees from the state between 2000 and 2017. How much of this money is profit, however, is unknown, as many companies operating direct provision centres, including all three of the above-mentioned companies, have unlimited status and therefore do not have to release their accounts publicly. In total, in 2017, the government paid out approximately 50 million euros to the various direct provision operators. In 2018, the budget was increased to 66 million to cover the increase in the number of new asylum applications month on month, and the aforementioned opening of a number of new accommodation centres, most of which are the result of deals with private companies to convert hotels in rural areas. As of September 2018, before the opening of the new centres in Moville, Ruski, Wicklow and Abelich, Ireland's asylum accommodation was running at 97% capacity, with the number of centres reported more recently as being over full. On top of this, a number of recent closures in the capital city means that there will soon be only 2 accommodation centres in Dublin, with almost all the newly opened centres being in rural areas. The most recent centre to announce closure was the Clondalkin Towers Hotel, the largest direct provision centre in Dublin. Originally scheduled to close this December, closure has now been pushed back to next summer. The company that run that centre are reported as having received more than 27 million euro from the state between 2006 and 2015. Despite tendering for new locations in Dublin to open up and replace the recent closures, the department responsible for asylum reported that no hotels or premises came forward that were based in Dublin. It's difficult to speculate as to why this might be, but many might wonder whether the enormous property bubble centred around the capital city has at all influenced things. For example, the average rent in Dublin was recorded in the latter half of 2018 as an eye-watering 1,600 euros, and the price of an average house in the city coming in just under 400,000 euros. These enormous price spikes have made Dublin more expensive to live in than even Silicon Valley, and has led to a serious housing crisis for Irish people. Profitable though direct provision appears to have been for many companies, perhaps now the current property bubble provides more lucrative opportunities for hoteliers as property speculators. Meanwhile, in rural areas where many hotels are underused for much of the year, direct provision is something welcomed by hotel businesses as a more reliable income stream. Direct provision isn't the only expense that government has in relation to asylum in Ireland though. In 2014, it was reported that the government spends an estimated 150 million euro each year on the asylum system, whilst in the 5-year period between 2005 and 2009, the government reportedly spent 1.27 billion on asylum, of which more than 400 million went into direct provision. Now that we looked a little at who's running the direct provision system, let's take a look at who the asylum seekers themselves are. As of September 2018, there are almost 6,000 people living in direct provision centres across Ireland. Perhaps contrary to the public perception of asylum seekers being predominantly women and children, 43% of 2018 applicants, the largest category recorded by the system, are single adult men. Most of the men in the system are aged between 18 and 35. More than half of people are from the continent of Africa, whilst another third are from Asia. Up to September, the top countries of origin for asylum applicants in 2018 are Georgia, Syria, Albania, Pakistan and Zimbabwe. Syria, not surprisingly, appears high on this list due to the ongoing conflict in that country. However, the other countries are perhaps less easily explained. Georgia and Albania, for instance, are both European countries that, whilst not economically all that well off, do not have any ongoing conflicts to speak of. In 2017, Georgia was granted visa-free access to travel throughout the European Union. Shortly afterwards, wealthier EU countries saw a spike in the number of Georgians claiming asylum. Despite this increase, Georgians have only rarely been granted asylum in the EU. Many EU nations responded negatively to this spike, with Germany going as far as to call it an abuse of the asylum system. Then, earlier this year, Germany, Ireland, and a number of other EU countries all declared Georgia a safe country, effectively ending any hope that people travelling from there would be granted any asylum. At the same time, Ireland declared Albania also to be a safe country. Since then, the number of Georgians requesting asylum in Germany has fallen to negligible amounts. However, in Ireland, Georgians and Albanians collectively still make up about 14% of the people in direct provision. One possible reason for this might be Ireland's notoriously lengthy asylum procedures. At present, asylum seekers spend an average of 2 years in direct provision, while some people have reportedly been in the system for more than 5 years. Appeals procedures can drag on for years. Meanwhile, fewer than 20% of those who were eventually given deportation orders ever actually leave the country. Even more incredibly, reports circulated earlier this year of an alleged scheme that officially doesn't exist, that enables illegal migrants who've been in the country for more than 5 years to remain in Ireland. This reputed scheme that doesn't exist was brought up in a court case involving a Nigerian woman who'd evaded deportation since 2011, and implies that judges in asylum cases are implementing recommendations from the McMahon report, despite this never being made official government policy. We'll talk more about the McMahon report a little bit later. If we look at the breakdown for countries of origin for existing direct provision residents, we see that the top countries are Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Pakistan, Albania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Discounting Albania, as we've already touched briefly upon it, it can be difficult searching for a pattern or a strong reasoning why people from these countries are coming to a tiny, wet island off the coast of Western Europe. Certainly, Ireland has no particular historical or cultural connection to these places that might make it a logical or attractive option. When we think about the political and social conditions in these locations, they are of course places of instability and intertribal conflict. For instance, Nigeria has had large parts of its territory occupied by Islamist insurgents within the last decade. And the Democratic Republic of Congo is long a place of simmering conflict. But many wonder how these conflicts lead to the large-scale flight of people all the way to another continent. Others also ask whether there aren't safe, peaceful states much nearer to those countries that people could more readily flee to. In Ireland and the rest of Europe, questions are often raised about whether or not many who claim asylum here are not, in fact, motivated by economic reasons. But in truth, when it comes to the third world, motivations of economics and of survival often blur into the same thing. I've touched on this a little bit in other videos, particularly how global demographics threaten to transform the West, where I talk about the enormous population growth that has occurred in migrant-sending third world countries, and look at how this is fueling struggles for food, water and land, thereby leading to mass migration. I'd recommend you check that video out for a fuller explanation of the topic. But it suffices here to say that simplistic, emotive narratives about asylum often fail to really capture what is going on and why migrants are coming to places like Ireland. None of this is of course to suggest that Ireland or Europe more generally should be particularly compelled to take in people from the third world. Neither is it to say that mass migration in any way could serve to fix any of the problems that exist there. So we've looked at the system and we've looked at the people living in the system. What remains now is to look at where things are headed. I mentioned briefly earlier the McMahon report, or to give it its proper, catchier title, the working group to report to government on improvements to the protection process, including direct provision and supports to asylum seekers. Whoa. Essentially, a government review, headed up by former Judge Brian McMahon, produced a report in 2015 that made various recommendations about how to change the Irish asylum system. Some of its key proposals included speeding up the time it takes to process asylum cases, closer working arrangements between government agencies and NGOs, access to third-level education and other training, the right to work, improvements to living conditions, and an increase to the financial allowance given to asylum seekers. Most of the recommended reforms have been implemented or are on their way to being implemented, with the exception of a proposed amnesty for people living in the system for 5 years and people who have evaded deportation for the same period, provided they have no criminal record. As we've already mentioned though, some in the legal system are allegedly operating as though this were accepted policy. At the same time as these reforms have been implemented, there has also been a radical change to the rates at which asylum claims are accepted or rejected in Ireland. In both 2016 and 2015, more than half of claims were rejected at the final decision stage, and only a little over 10% were given refugee status at the first instance. However, in 2017, approximately 80% of claims were accepted at the final stage, and roughly 75% given refugee status at the first instance. Quite what explains this turnaround, whether or not it's an anomaly, or is in some way a result of the government's response to the McMahon report, is something I haven't yet found out. For now, we'll have to wait to see what 2018's numbers look like. Ireland has also recently implemented into law the European Reception Directive. which effectively commits EU states to homogenise the conditions that asylum seekers live under across the Union, meaning that Ireland's system must now, in principle at least, be as generous as, for example, Germany's. As chaotic and mired in controversy as Ireland's asylum system is, in real numbers, Ireland actually takes in fewer asylum seekers annually than other comparably sized EU nations. This appears to be a legacy feature of Ireland's system, whose strictness and inefficiencies were allegedly an attempt to dissuade higher numbers of people from coming to Ireland through the asylum route. However, various policy changes and international agreements look likely to spell an end to whatever remains of that restrictiveness. Ireland, like other states, is currently waiting on reforms to be finalised by the EU that will update the superstate's common asylum policy, with the possibility of introducing mandatory quotas for the redistribution of refugees and amending the Dublin regulations, which hitherto meant asylum seekers looking for asylum in the EU had to claim it in the first EU country they entered, rather than choosing which one they wanted after entering the EU's borders. At present, these reforms have been held up by a handful of dissenting countries, who reject, in particular, the mandatory relocation quotas. For now, it seems the EU will be going ahead with a voluntary resettlement system, whereby countries can apparently opt in to take a share of refugees. Ireland's Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, earlier this year expressed support for voluntary redistribution, stating that any states that fail to volunteer should be forced to pay significant financial contributions to the EU to cover the costs involved with taking in refugees. Back in Ireland, another reform that is currently under discussion concerns family reunification for refugees. Up until a few years ago, Ireland had quite an open policy when it came to family reunification. In 2016 though, changes were brought in that tried to restrict reunification, effectively only to spouses and dependent children. Under the pre-2016 system, Minister for Justice David Stanton reported that the average number of family members applied for was 20, whilst the highest recorded was 70. However, a bill is currently going through the Irish political system that, if passed, would overturn these recent restrictions and broaden the definition of family to include extended family members. In the Dáil debate concerning this amendment, Justice Minister David Stanton defended the current law, noting that the discretionary powers it affords the relevant minister quite often enables extended family members to enter Ireland anyway. He also noted that alongside the normal system of family reunification, the government is running a parallel family reunification programme called IHAP, which does allow for a broader range of family members and is aimed at the families of refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Somalia, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Myanmar, Eritrea and Burundi. Over the next 2 years, IHAP will allow for a further 530 individuals to come to Ireland and is in part formulated with the specific aim of speeding up the family reunification process. Also relevant to the issue of family reunification, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission have recently put 2 cases before the Court of Appeal that argue naturalised citizens no longer availing of the refugee designation should also be entitled to family reunification, on the grounds that family reunification for refugees, even after naturalisation, is guaranteed by the right to family life under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and also, potentially, the Irish Constitution. It's maybe worth noting that the controversial Article 8 has been used in other European countries to define much broader definitions of family than any Irish legislation hitherto has, and has also been used elsewhere in Europe to block deportations. Perhaps unsurprisingly, family reunification is alleged to be exacerbating the current housing crisis and putting pressure on homelessness services. Additional to all of this, Ireland recently signed the controversial UN Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. The compact is intended to reframe political discussion on migration, to focus its management more across international lines, and to better empower migrants, protecting them from the abuses of people traffickers and so on. Perhaps most worrying to some, the compact also outlines commitments for states to combat media that, quote, promote intolerance, xenophobia and other forms of discrimination towards migrants. The compact, although not binding in law, is perhaps best taken as an indication of where those states that signed it intend for their national policy to go, i.e. to stifle robust criticism of migration and to facilitate, rather than restrict or slow down, the mass immigration that the world is in the midst of. There's much more I could go into, but here's perhaps a good place to start winding down. Before we end the video though, it's worth looking at some comments made by Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney recently, after he was asked by a member of the public to talk about the UN Compact on migration.
The continent of Africa, in the next 25 to 30 years, we expect that there'll be an extra billion people on that continent. And so we need to find new ways of addressing the realities of the mass movement of people by trying to create economies and societies that people want to be part of. I mean, if you take an example of this, in Ethiopia, which has a rapidly growing population, to simply keep unemployment at the rate that it's at today, because of there's so many extra young people coming of age in terms of employability, they need to create an extra 2 million jobs every year. That's all the jobs in Ireland. Every year needs to be added to the working population of Ethiopia alone to simply keep pace with their population growth. Next door in Kenya is an extra 1 million people. Like, these are impossible numbers. And so this is part of the development challenge that the EU has to take on with a much, much more ambitious partnership with Africa. Partly because of what we know the alternative would be, which is a huge migration challenge for the EU. Instead of there being hundreds of thousands of people looking to enter the EU, we may well be in the millions. And all of the tensions that will cause. I happen to be somebody who is quite liberal on migration. I believe that Ireland has been enhanced significantly by the fact that so many people who are not born in Ireland are now part of our society and economy. But of course, we need to also ensure that we can manage the numbers that are being welcomed and that they can integrate appropriately. We estimate, and I was saying it earlier, over the next 20 years that the population of Ireland will certainly grow by an extra 1 million people. Linked to that estimate is that half of that number won't have been born in Ireland. I think that will be a really good thing for our society, but we do need to manage it carefully so that we don't allow the politics of migration to play a big part in Irish politics, because I think it pulls us down a dangerous direction.
What Coveney's comments reveal is that he, and likely much of the rest of Ireland's political elite, are well aware of the epochal demographic changes that are occurring in the Third World, and that are the real drivers behind mass migration to the West. But rather than take on people's concerns and look to shield the country from the adverse effects of this enormous change, he views it as something to exploit. What it also reveals is that, as with most neoliberal Western politicians, he views Ireland as little more than an economy, a marketplace, rather than a home for a distinct culture and national community. The implications of this sort of thinking at the very top of our society are huge. And as I noted in the aforementioned video, The Transformation of Ireland, the consequences have the potential to totally reshape Ireland over the next few decades. Although the asylum system is really just a small strand of the immigration to Ireland, it's one with powerful moral implications to the public discourse, selling immigration to people on the basis of compassion and framing opposition to it as bigotry and meanness, even when it leads to virtual overnight transformation of one's own hometown. On this matter, both Ireland's state and private media companies are effectively all in lockstep with the government's own thinking, helping to promote multiculturalism and diversity as virtuous and enriching, immigration as essential to the economy, and portraying those who seek asylum in a suitably sympathetic light, as seen in RTE's recent drama, Taken Down. Amusingly, a concurrent incident at a bus stop, in which a man of African appearance was caught on video engaging in an indecent act right beside a poster for the show, perhaps gave everyone a glimpse of a less noble side of third world immigration. But much like the hotel owners and direct provision centre operators, the Irish political elite's objectives here have less to do with compassion and are just more of the same old Irish-style cronyism and petty profiteering that has plagued the country for many generations. The Irish state's turn towards global openness and simultaneous expression of contempt for backward rural Ireland are not coincidental. The new Ireland they envisage is to be a global marketplace where Irish people are not at the centre of things. Unless a rapid sea change occurs in Irish politics and the vision of the current political elites begins to face serious questions, then the disenfranchisement of the Irish people in their own homeland will only continue.